You're now watching Around the Horne, the weekly internationalist news update with author and historian Gerald Horne.
Today is Wednesday, December 10th, 2025. Welcome everyone to the weekly series entitled Around the Horne, which is an internationalist news update with historian and Professor Gerald Horne. We are excited to announce that Dr. Horne's latest book, The Counter-Revolution of 1893, The Hawaii Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism in the Asia-Pacific Basin, will be released in mid-January and is already available for pre-order on the International Publisher's website. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show, The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and Dr. Horne also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Pacific. And replays of both shows can be found on the Activist News Network. And check out the Around the Horne Substack, entitled Notes from Around the Horne, which is a weekly list of some of the articles reviewed by Dr. Horne in preparation for each week's show. The link can be found in the description of this show. Dr. Horne, thank you for coming back on the show, and welcome back to Around the Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the Horne, first want to ask you about news that's related to Latin America and the Caribbean. First, regarding the election in Chile. As expected, far-right politician Jose Cast won Chile's presidential runoff on Sunday, taking nearly 58% of the vote. Cast, whose father was a member of the Nazi Party in Germany, finished second in November's first round, 2 points behind leftist Janet Jara, but head-to-head polling consistently favored him heading into the decisive round. He will become Chile's most right-wing president since former dictator Augusto Pinochet, whom Cast openly praises. And on December 9th, Brazil's foreign policy chief, Celso Amorim, stated that Brazil has drawn a clear line, namely that Brazil will not demand that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro steps down, and Brazil has taken a hardline stance against U.S. attacking Venezuela. And tomorrow, the U.S. Congress is expected to vote on a bipartisan war powers resolution aimed at blocking President Trump from launching an attack on Venezuela. Dr. Horne, as the U.S. continues to blow up fishing boats of the coasts of Venezuela and seized a Venezuela supertanker headed to Cuba, what is your latest analysis and prognosis of U.S.'s war against Venezuela, particularly in light of various stories we just outlined?
Well, first of all, it's obvious that the election in Chile is a setback. However, we should not dismiss easily nor readily the fact that the leader of the opposition, a communist woman, received 42% of the vote. And I think that bespeaks a certain level of organization that will serve Chile well going forward. Recall that modern Chile elected a socialist, speaking of Salvador Allende in 1970, and it required a military coup backed by U.S. imperialism on September 11th, 1973, to take him down. We should also recognize that Washington has upped the ante. That is to say, the blockade against Cuba is now accompanied by a blockade against Venezuela. Comrades should recognize that this is wholly and entirely consistent with the so-called national security strategy, which we've been talking about quite a bit in recent weeks, which, as you may recall, makes this hemisphere the priority for U.S. imperialism. Now, for those who have been wondering why China is not the priority, I think that it's not explicitly, although it is implicitly. What I mean by that is that many war games conducted by the Pentagon suggest that the United States would not fare very well in terms of a military confrontation with Beijing. And so therefore, the strategy is to bulwark U.S. imperialism by seizing the resources of various countries, Venezuela in the first place, and knocking together an Uncle Sam coalition led by Washington. I think we need to recognize as well that U.S. imperialism has violated one of the major principles of many of its practitioners, not only including Henry Kissinger, the late Secretary of State during the 1970s, but going back to the late 19th century, which is what I discuss in part in the book, The Counter-Revolution of 1893. That is to say, that U.S. imperialism sees it as strategically necessary to make sure that the Eurasian landmass is not united against Washington. That is to say, an alliance between Russia and China. And with the proxy war of Ukraine pitted against Moscow, that is precisely what's happened, because Moscow has been able to prevail thus far because of tightening relations with Beijing. And I think that the Trump wing of the ruling class has decided that the better part of wisdom is to try to move away from confronting Russia and China simultaneously, and perhaps trying to woo Russia, which is a fool's errand, but they're going to try nonetheless. We should also recognize that this so-called Monroe Doctrine, which is an obvious play on the moth-eaten Monroe Doctrine of 2 centuries previously, is basically off on the wrong foot, not only because Venezuela has not gone for the Trump bluff, and in fact is now launching a ghost fleet of tankers, not unlike what Russia has done to evade sanctions against its oil fleet. But if you look at the basic figures of this hemisphere, you'll quickly arrive at the conclusion that U.S. imperialism has a formidable challenge in trying to corral the hemisphere. The 3 most populous nations in this hemisphere are Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, all of which to a greater or lesser degree are opposed to the attempt to overthrow Maduro in Caracas. Likewise, the political commissar of the hemisphere, speaking of Cuba, is firmly and stoutly on the Maduro team. This does not bode very well. On the other hand, we would be remiss if we failed to acknowledge the other side, which has some assets all of its own. Recall Bukele in El Salvador and the prison he's established there, to which the United States has been shipping various migrants and has threatened to ship U.S. nationals if we're not careful. The Bukele forces showed up in Santiago de Chile for the CAS victory. And one of the problems we face with this opposition in the hemisphere is that they're so hard-nosed. We mentioned, of course, the Nazi connections of Mr. Cass, the ultra-rightist connections of Bukele, the fact that Milei in Argentina is a kind of anarcho-capitalist with very strong ties to the right wing in the Argentine military, which committed and perpetrated massive human rights violations during the dirty war of the 1970s. We have Noboa in Ecuador, very close to the South Florida massacre and mafia, and as well has been implicated in drug dealing, believe it or not, which makes it curious as to why that particular narco trafficking regime is not in the crosshairs. And likely it's possible that when the dust settles in Tegucigalpa, that Honduras will be on the right-wing team as well. I noticed that the foreign minister of Paraguay was meeting and conferring with Marco Rubio, Secretary of State of the United States, just the other day. And Paraguay probably has some of the deepest pro-Nazi tendencies in the hemisphere, believe it or not, making what's happening in Chile seem tame by comparison. The wild card will be the role of Canada. And as we shall note shortly in discussing other North Atlantic nations, they have been shell-shocked by this national security strategy, and that includes Canada. And that nation, amongst others, does not seem to recognize that it is being demoted by U.S. imperialism. And so they should adapt accordingly by backing away from the attempt to overthrow Maduro in Caracas. But I don't think that Ottawa is there yet. Also on the positive side of the ledger, we must give a shout out and a salute to the Answer Coalition, Act Now to Stop War and Racism, which held demonstrations on a hands-off Venezuela basis in 65 different cities in the United States in the last week or so. And that kind of militancy and that kind of organization is what we need to turn this country around and to stop this harassment of Caracas.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about several stories out of Europe. First, last week, as U.S. President Donald Trump laid into European leaders, in the latest sign of a growing transatlantic rift, the Ukraine sent Washington an updated plan for ending Russia's invasion. In addition, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has declared the Pax Americana over, warning of a permanent U.S. withdrawal from Europe. And Denmark's military intelligence service has for the first time in history classified the U.S. as a security risk, a striking shift in how one of Washington's closest European allies assesses the transatlantic relationship. Lastly, the European Union's former top diplomat, Josep Borrell, characterized the new U.S. national security strategy as, quote, a declaration of political war. Similarly, NATO chief Mark Rutte directed European countries to, quote, prepare for scale of war our grandparents endured. Dr. Horne, what has been the impact of the Trump administration's 2025 national security strategy, particularly with regards to U.S. relations with Europe?
Well, as suggested, the North Atlantic countries, particularly the Europeans, are having a kind of collective nervous breakdown. Recall what occurred in February 2025 at the Munich Security Conference addressed by Vice President Vance, where he gave a kind of out-of-town audition to many of the major themes enunciated in the national security strategy, including backing Nazi-friendly forces, such as the Alternative for Germany Party in Berlin, the idea that Europe is facing some sort of civilizational erasure because of migration, particularly migration from Africa and from predominantly Muslim countries. Recall that after Mr. Vance finished his remarks, the host of that meeting came to the microphone and immediately burst into tears, as if he were having a nervous breakdown. And I think nervous breakdown is an apt characterization of what's befalling many of the leaders in Western Europe. Let's start with Mark Rutte, the man who quite infamously and notoriously referred to Donald J. Trump as Daddy Trump, and of course now is prattling and prating about the possibility of war. Now, this is obviously bizarre because Europe could not withstand war with Russia for a week, given the fact that Moscow is the major nuclear power on planet Earth, and a war would quickly turn nuclear. And if China intervened on the side of Russia, then the Europeans could not last in a conflict for more than 2 or 3 days. But I think that what they're doing is they're harking back to their glory days. They do not want to see their glory days disappear, which is why they're issuing all these threats. And what's even more bizarre is the fact that with regard to the proxy war in Ukraine, they have these delusions that it can continue even without the participation of U.S. imperialism. And to that end, you had this remarkable meeting in Berlin just this week, where once again, they're talking to themselves. They're talking to the Russians. That is to say, you have Steve Witkoff present, the U.S. advisor, and you have Mr. Zelensky there, and you have the European leaders there, and they're negotiating amongst themselves. It's really quite something. I think that it's fair to say that the Europeans are living in a dream world. It's difficult for them to adjust to the reality that they've misplayed their cards. Somehow U.S. imperialism is throwing them overboard. They're unable to obviously compete with the People's Republic of China. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal just today about Germany seeking a divorce from China. And I'm sure that China will not necessarily miss Germany the way Germany will miss China. And then they're further alienating U.S. imperialism by seeking to put their grubby little paws on billions of dollars in Russian assets, which Mr. Trump sees as a way to start an investment fund that will serve to exploit the vast resources in gold, platinum, natural gas, and oil that Russia enjoys. As we've said repeatedly, and it bears repetition, our movement has a very tricky task. That is to say, we have to drive Mr. Trump out of office without seeing a return to office and a return to power of the Democrats, who will be prone to try to revive and resuscitate the discredited strategy of allying with the Europeans against both Russia and China, and therefore repeating the mistakes of various Democratic presidents going back to Harry S. Truman with the conflict in Korea, 1950 to 1953, not to mention the disastrous Vietnam policy of Democratic President Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas. Obviously, this Democratic Party weakness, as we once again said repeatedly, is a result of harebrained strategies of the 1950s and 1960s involving the labor movement and the NAACP, where they decided to either tail after a wing of the US ruling class on foreign policy, or in the case of the NAACP, basically duck foreign policy altogether, except for occasionally endorsing schemes like the genocidal war in Vietnam. So minimally, it seems to me that we know what our tasks are. The question is, will we be able to execute on those tasks?
Mr. Horne, as we go around the horn, I want to ask you about what appears to be growing strains and fissures on the right in the U.S. It was reported on December 13th that President Trump's vow to seek revenge against the Indiana Republicans, who rejected a new House map, risks further dividing the party as it looks toward the midterms. President Trump and his allies have made it clear they intend to support primary challenges against the Hoosier State Republicans, who refuse to vote for the map. But many Republicans fear the effort could divert the party's focus and splinter the party at a time when the GOP is desperately vying to keep its majority next year. Dr. Horne, it seems that increasingly there are widening cracks in the MAGA movement. But what is your assessment of how significant this is?
These cracks and fissures and splits and cleavages are significant and profound. They cut to the core of politics in this country as we speak. And I'll go so far as to suggest that the disarray in the right wing right now has taken us away to a degree from the kind of fascism that seemed on offer as recently as the spring of 2025. Let's start with the cleavage that we've spoken about before between the pro-Zionist faction and the Hitler's cool faction led by Nick Fuentes, who has cozied up to former Fox News broadcaster Tucker Carlson, who, by the way, was visiting sick children and injured children in Gaza just a few days ago, and has decided to buy real estate in Qatar, the Persian Gulf monarchy, and has been issuing ever more strident criticisms of Mr. Netanyahu in Israeli policy, which in turn has led the pro-Zionist forces, suggested by Mark Levin of Fox News, to give as good as Mr. Carlson is giving out. Then there's a kind of gay panic in the right wing of the United States, with charges of alleged homosexuality on the part of many Republican leaders, which has led to a round robin of accusations and charges and denials. In the crosshairs to a degree is Richard Grenell. You may recall under Trump 1.0 was a kind of freelance negotiator for Mr. Trump, and he thought that he could ascend to being Secretary of State, but apparently his, quote, sexual orientation, unquote, prevented that from taking place. And then ever present is the racism in the GOP, which is leading to splits. For example, Vivek Ramaswamy, who, as you know, is of South Asian descent, is running for governor of Ohio. And you've had many Trump forces saying that they would not vote for him because they see him as representative of the kinds of immigrant forces that they're hotly opposed to. You've even had certain Trump forces go so far as to suggest that they would vote for Gavin Newsom over J.D. Vance, because Gavin Newsom at least has a blonde wife and J.D. Vance has a wife of South Asian ancestry. The Susie Wiles interview, speaking of the chief of staff in the White House, has been obviously a moment with regard to this discussion, because she unveiled tensions between Secretary of State Marco Rubio and J.D. Vance as to who will have the pole position to replace Mr. Trump in 2028. Of course, we've talked about the case of Jeffrey Epstein. The files supposedly will be released on Friday. Who knows what they will expose and what they will reveal. But Susie Wiles sharply criticized the Attorney General, her fellow Floridian, Scam Bondi, who she says really whiffed, her verb, not mine, with regard to the release of these files. Dan Bongino, number 2 in the FBI, has just stepped down. Kash Patel apparently has one foot on a banana peel, and he's probably next. I'm speaking, of course, of the leader of the FBI, who, once again, with regard to the Brown University shootings, got ahead of the story by prematurely suggesting that the culprit had been found when that was not true. Still, once again, in terms of analyzing the correlation of forces, we should not forget that the right wing has a trump card in terms of the 6-person majority on the U.S. Supreme Court, which seems willing to give a thumbs up to whatever Mr. Trump proposes. The Trump forces still have a mass base within the settler descendant working class and middle class. And of course, one of the demerits on our side is that too often folks on the left refuse to acknowledge that basic reality, the basic ABCs of US politics. However, given our victory in the New York City race for mayor and the aforementioned cleavages and fissures between and amongst the right wing, I think it's fair to say that we should not be uncorking the champagne bottles just yet. But at the same time, we should recognize that things look a mite better in December 2025 than they looked in the spring of 2025.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about China and Latin America. On December 10th, China issued a policy paper on Latin America and the Caribbean. China has stated that the latest policy paper outlines its hope and desire to join hands with Latin America and the Caribbean to promote the 5 programs, namely on solidarity, development, civilization, peace, and people-to-people connectivity, to advance shared development and revitalization. Martin Charles, the ambassador of Dominica to China, said the implementation of the policy paper will be fundamental in continuing the advancement of a China-Latin America and the Caribbean community with a shared future, and will have direct impacts on cooperation in infrastructure construction, education, culture, agriculture, and other areas, and that the paper reiterates China's commitment to providing development assistance without political conditions and rejects third-party interference in its relations with the region. Dr. Horne, what is your analysis and assessment of China's new policy paper on Latin America and the Caribbean?
Well, first of all, it's a refutation and rebuke of the national security strategy aforementioned, which supposes that the United States will have a stranglehold on Latin America and the Caribbean. You do not have to peruse this policy paper to recognize that China has established deep links in this hemisphere, starting, for example, with Canada, which has improved its relations with Beijing, necessarily and understandably, given its frayed relations with Washington. It does not stop there. Of course, it's been very busy in Bahamas, one of the closest neighbors of the United States of America. I don't not have to repeat or recite its close relations with Cuba and everything from transport to medicines. And a footnote here, because it's been reported of late that in its anti-immigrant ethos, U.S. imperialism, speaking of the Trump regime, has been deporting Cuban migrants to Guantanamo, the base on the island of freedom that the United States occupies illicitly. And recall that it was not so long ago that those accused in the so-called war on terror were being housed in Guantanamo, and now Cubans are being housed there. And that may have something to do with the fact that in the recent election in Miami, a non-Cuban prevailed for the first time in decades. In fact, a Democratic Party leader prevailed, which is quite unusual given the fact that the Cuban-American community in South Florida is known for its conservative tendencies. I should also mention, as we go down the list, that it's going to be very difficult to reverse China's incursions in this hemisphere. Look at Argentina, for example, where you had President Milei running on this platform that he was going to turn the screws against China, but of course did a 180-degree reversal once he assumed office, to the point where when U.S. imperialism tried to turn up the heat against China, Mr. Milei and the farmers, who are specialists in soybeans, began to steal the Chinese market from Midwestern U.S. farmers. I should mention in this context, since we're on this question of China, that we've noted a number of times previously that we might be living through a profound and dramatic shift in the global correlation of forces with the decline of U.S. imperialism. We talked about that with regard to the BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia, some months ago. We talked about it with regard to that impressive military parade in Beijing in early September 2025. And we should also refresh our recollection with regard to the meeting between President Xi and Mr. Trump in South Korea some weeks ago, where basically Mr. Trump cried uncle and pulled back with regard to his attempt to launch this trade war against China. There will be a number of meetings between the two leaders. And I think, once again, that the national security strategy, which puts Latin America in the forefront of U.S. concerns, perversely and ironically, is a reflection of the fact that the United States can really not compete effectively, frontally, with the People's Republic of China. So with regard to this policy paper, with regard to China, it's good news all the way. And once again, it should remind us that if the correlation of forces and the balance of forces globally are in our favor, that may be a hint that it's time for us to go on the offensive domestically.
Dr. Horne, as we go around the horn, we want to ask you about Turkey's relationship with Somalia. On December 13th, it was reported that Turkey has begun construction of a satellite and rocket launch site on Somalia's Indian Ocean coast. A project officials say will advance Ankara's space ambitions, and that analysts say is already attracting heightened scrutiny from major world powers. The spaceport is being developed under Turkish state authority on a coastal area measuring about 30 by 30 kilometers. Turkish officials say the facility will give the country its first platform for orbital launches and strengthen its ability to conduct independent space missions. Turkey has stated that Somalia's coastline is a strategic site with the open ocean access required for safe launch and recovery operations, and they went on to state that only a small number of locations worldwide offer the combination of geography and coastal conditions needed for full-scale spaceflight. Dr. Horne, we are seeing increasing Turkish influence in Somalia. What are the regional and broader implications of this?
Well, they're significant. First of all, more specifically with regard to the spaceport, it has an advantage insofar as it's close to the equator, and our geophysicists tell us that that gives this Turkish effort more of a basis for success. I should also mention that Turkey is quite active in predominantly Muslim nations on the continent of Africa, and that includes the Sahel states, which Turkey deserves a pat on the back for its aid to Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, in terms of drones to fight these religious zealots who dub themselves Muslim, in terms of airports, in terms of hotels, etc. With regard to Somalia, Turkey is important in every area of the economy and society, from picking up garbage to airport security. Those with a long and lengthy memory might conclude that this is appropriate given the fact that Ottoman Turkey for centuries played an instrumental and pivotal role in the slave trade heading eastward. And of course, what is now Istanbul, along with the former province that is Egypt, speaking of Cairo, had some of the most bounteous slave markets of Africans, featuring Sudanese and Ethiopians in particular, as any that existed, for example, in the United States, for example, New Orleans. So once again, we should keep an eye on what Turkey is doing in Africa. At the same time, of course, it should do more given its rather horrendous role, his horrendous role historically. But I'm afraid we've reached the end of the road.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.